let's jump right into this explainer. We are mapping out a really fascinating, honestly kind of wild timeline today. We're going to look at the complex structural and political factors that led to the complete collapse of Evo Morales' 13-year presidency down in Bolivia. I mean, how exactly does a leader go from enjoying historic, totally overwhelming popularity to literally fleeing his own country? Well, that is exactly what we're going to untangle right now. We'll be tracking the key milestones from 2006 all the way to 2019 and watching how public support and opposition shifted so dramatically. Okay, let's dive into this. To make sure we're not just, skimming the surface of the politics here, our timeline is actually built on a really rigorous academic framework. We are drawing from research out of the Intermestic Journal of International Studies, specifically looking at Mainwaring and Linen's theory of regime survival and fall. It's absolutely crucial for understanding the deep dynamics of why political structures hold together and ultimately why they shatter. So, here is our chronological roadmap for today. 1. The historic rise. 2. First cracks emerge. 3. The term limit dilemma. 4. Shifts in opposition power. And 5. The 2019 regime collapse. Section 1. The historic rise. The 2006 to 2010 era. To really understand the fall, we have to start at the absolute peak of this regime back in early 2006. It was a moment of profound, overflowing joy in Bolivia as they inaugurated their very first indigenous president. And Morales didn't just win. He hit the ground running with rapid, sweeping policy changes. Just months into his term, he nationalized the country's gas sector. And by 2009, he had pushed through a brand new constitution, fundamentally shifting Bolivia from a republic to a plurinational state, which heavily favored indigenous rights and state control. And it's really important to get that this was not some narrow victory. Morales rode the massive momentum of the 2003 gas protests right into office, completely crushing his traditional right-wing opponent, Jorge Quiroga. Morales took 53.7% of the vote compared to Quiroga's 28.6%, so he had a massive mandate right from day one. A huge part of that early immense popularity was fueled by some absolutely staggering economic success. Driven by that gas nationalization and super high global commodity prices, Bolivia's GDP literally quadrupled. It went from $9 billion to $37 billion. And the impact on real people was massive. The extreme poverty rate dropped from over 38% down to just 15.2%. We're talking massive infrastructure spending, rising minimum wages, and bringing marginalized groups into the economy like never before. Section 2. First cracks emerge. The 2011 to 2014 era. Now, despite all that undeniable economic success, severe political friction started brewing right within his own foundational base. We start to see a really deep ideological split. Indigenous support, which was basically the bedrock of the Morales government, began to fracture over this bitter dispute between environmental preservation on one side and economic development on the other. And that brings us to the Tipnis conflict, which is arguably the very first major crack in his foundation. Over 1,000 indigenous people marched all the way from the lowlands to the capital of La Paz. Why? Well, they were trying to stop the government from building a 300-kilometer highway right through a protected national park and indigenous territory. It was a huge deal because it highlighted a glaring paradox. The state's development-focused, extractive policies were suddenly clashing head-on with its own pro-indigenous and pro-environment rhetoric. But it is vital to remember that this crack did not immediately sink the ship. Actually, in the 2014 elections, Morales increased his vote share to an astounding 61.4%. How did he pull that off? Well, the regime temporarily halted the highway, and combined with their rock-solid economic track record, it was still more than enough to secure a massive win. But, the seeds of organized internal opposition had definitely been planted. Section 3. The term limit dilemma. The 2016 to 2018 era. Okay, this right here is the critical turning point of our whole timeline. The focus shifts entirely away from policy disputes and turns into a full-blown, deep-seated constitutional crisis. See, the 2009 Constitution, the one Morales himself championed, limited a president to 2 consecutive terms. Morales pushed for a national referendum to change that rule so he could run for a 4th term. When that didn't go his way, his party, MAS, found another route, and it permanently altered the regime's trajectory. In that February 2016 referendum, the public narrowly rejected his bid to change the Constitution. 51% voted no, and 49% voted yes. So a razor-thin margin for sure, but still a clear, democratic directive from the public. respect the term limits. So the crucial point is how the regime reacted to that loss. Instead of just stepping down, the ruling party went to the Constitutional Court. They actually argued that term limits violated Morales' human rights to run for office. And the court, which was packed with allies, agreed. Deciding to bypass a direct public vote and push forward as a candidate anyway was monumental political blunder. It completely polarized Bolivian society and made it look like the party was totally reliant on just one person.
Section 4. Shifts in opposition power. Who challenged the regime?
All that polarization triggered a massive shift. The opposition definitely hadn't been sitting still. They were actively transforming from these sort of isolated regional elites into a huge, multifaceted national movement. Now, remember that academic theory we mentioned at the start? Mainwaring and Lannan argue a regime falls when three exact conditions line up. First, new actors join the opposition. Second, political resources shift toward that opposition. And third, key political actors actually switch sides to balance the power. And as we're about to see, all three of those premises were actively coalescing against Morales. Now, what's really interesting is how much the opposition's identity expanded. Historically, his opponents were mostly the traditional, white mestizo elites in the eastern Media Luna lowlands who were frustrated by economic restructuring. But by 2019, the opposition had grown into this vast coalition. It now included conservative Catholics who felt marginalized, indigenous groups who had been disillusioned ever since those highway protests, and eventually the military itself. A really key figure in this transformation was Luis Fernando Camacho. He emerged as the new, aggressive face of the opposition. When Morales' supporters blundered by blockading an airport to stop Camacho, it ironically just launched him straight onto the national stage. He brilliantly used the Bible and Catholic symbolism as a direct counter-narrative to Morales' indigenous state-making, and he united traditional elites and religious conservatives in a way literally no one else had managed before. And it wasn't just domestic. At the exact same time, the regime was facing mounting pressure from the outside. The global political landscape was shifting, and Morales had previously expelled the U.S. ambassador, the DEA, and USAID years earlier. So when the crisis finally hit, the Morales administration found itself incredibly isolated on the international stage.
Section 5. The 2019 regime collapse. The final days.
This is the climax. This is where all those structural factors and political frictions finally just shatter the regime entirely. General elections were held on October 20th, 2019. Almost immediately, controversy blew up over a weird pause in the vote counting. By early November, the Organization of American States issued a report alleging serious irregularities. And then, by November 10th, after weeks of paralyzing protests, Morales suddenly resigned and fled to Mexico. It all happened incredibly fast. Now, we have to look at the two fiercely opposing narratives of this collapse. On one side, the OAS and the opposition claimed that deliberate electoral fraud artificially inflated Morales' vote count by just enough, giving him that 10% margin he needed to avoid a really risky runoff election. But on the exact opposite side, Morales and his allies argued there was absolutely no fraud and that he was simply the victim of a politically motivated coup orchestrated by right-wing forces with international interference.
Regardless of which narrative you look at, the actual mechanics of the fall perfectly validate that third premise of our academic theory: key actors switching sides. The final dominoes fell when massive nationwide protests completely overwhelmed the capital. Then, police forces began to mutiny across different cities. The ultimate point of no return for the regime's survival? Military Commander Williams Kaliman remained totally passive and eventually suggested Morales step down. Having completely lost his security apparatus, Morales resigned.
It's just a dramatic, stunning end to a 13-year era. And it leaves us with this really powerful question to chew on. When a leader fundamentally transforms a nation's economy, literally lifting millions out of poverty, but ultimately strains its democratic institutions to the breaking point, does their eventual fall erase their historic rise? It is a complex duality that completely defines the legacy of Evo Morales. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and we'll see you next time.